Does a recent Christian survey about New Year's resolutions reveal the selfishness of Christians, or something more about the impact that God has on all of our lives? We'll discuss it on today's broadcast.
J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us on today's broadcast. I'm Jimmy Wallace.
And I'm J. Warner Wallace. You know, we are now well into the new year, and so probably people who made resolutions in the beginning of the year have already abandoned. I didn't discuss this with you in advance, Jimmy, but have you abandoned any resolutions, or are you still holding, and what are those resolutions you made, if any?
I don't know if I made I wasn't thinking of it like, oh, it's a New Year's resolution, but I definitely, throughout the holidays, I've been eating so much junk food, especially from Thanksgiving to Christmas. I was definitely thinking, as soon as Christmas is over, I got to cut down on stuff. So I've tried to make caffeine a little bit less of a daily endeavor. I mean, I'm still drinking caffeine, but try not to start every morning with it. And I've tried to cut my sweets back. I got a major sweet tooth, so there's no way to totally cut it out. But I've tried to reduce it, so I guess that would be my New Year's resolution. And so far, so good. I mean, it's only been a few weeks, but I'm hanging in there.
Well,
what about you?
Okay. So same thing. And I think that it's interesting, and this is what we always say, right? Like, we have all this great season of eating whatever you want, it feels like, or how can you say no to people who make you, bring you stuff?
Yeah.
And then at some point you're like, okay, this is enough. This is ridiculous. I got to find some way to reduce my intake. So I think I'm the same way. And isn't it interesting that if you look at polls and surveys of New Year's resolutions, you will find that people often will put that fitness issue is first and foremost. Now, I think that's because, if New Year's fell in June or maybe in March and it was 3 months behind a season of eating, I wonder if this would even be part of people's New Year's resolutions. It's only because it happens to be at the very end of this season of eating that we say, hey, we should probably stop eating. Maybe that's what it is. But I wanted to bring up a survey to start this discussion that is done from a Christian source. It's a Lifeway survey. It's a Lifeway Research did this, Christian organization. It's called New Year's Resolutions Focus on Health, God, and Money. So if you're seeing this webpage, you can always research it yourself and see what they say. Now, what's interesting about it is they give you a certain number of choices, and here is the graph, right, that shows the way these things came out. It turns out, when it comes to health, is like everyone's first thing, and it's fitness, those kinds of things. But look at what's number 2. My relationship with God falls in that number 2 category, and it turns out that it's not just, they actually break it down to age groups. And surprisingly, a lot of millennials, people your age, will report that this is a priority for them. Isn't it Now, remember that my relationship with God is probably one of the options that was given, because here are the options. My health, my relationship with God, my finances, my relationship with a family member, my use of time, my work, my relationship with a friend, or none of these. So that's why you can it's a tip-off that, they've given you these options and you can say none of these. But so it turns out that young adults age 18 to 34 were the most likely, right? They responded and they said things that this relationship with God was important to them. Now,
hey, I'm glad to hear that. I'm almost surprised to see, I guess I would have, maybe I'm being too skeptical. I guess I'm surprised to see that many people in that age group interest in God. I think that's a positive. I think that's a good thing to see.
Yeah, well, as I said, turns out, here's what the article says. It says that those aged 18 to 34, 35%, and 35 to 49, so a little bit older, 35%, are more likely than, this is weird, more likely than those aged 50 to 64, and those 65 and older to say they have made a previous New Year's resolution. This is really talking about how the survey was taken. It's like they are surveying what do you typically make as your New Year's resolution?
Yeah, not necessarily this year, but at some point they made it.
Yeah, right. And so what's interesting about that is that if you look at that, now you might argue, well, is it because young people are more interested in God? Well, the statistics kind of show us that young people do not appear to be as interested in God as people my age. As a matter of fact, we know from things we've already talked about on this broadcast that people in your group are more likely to be religiously unaffiliated. But what it might just be is that that there's a sense in this age group, your age group, that I'm not connected well enough to God. And if I'm my age, I already feel like, well, that's not a New Year's resolution because I don't feel like I struggle in that area.
Yeah, it's something. Yeah, exactly. It's because you have some more religious connection. You're going to church in that older age group, so that's it's less on. It's on the back of your mind. Whereas, if you're in your 20s, maybe you're not going to church, or you went to church only a couple of times. This is an area you really could grow in if you actually made an effort.
Yeah, so maybe that is revealing of what we see in the other polls, that younger people, and especially those, what you see it's interesting, what you see in the Pew Report polls is that younger people are less likely to identify, and they're starting to, and they used to, and they're more likely to now be recently unidentified, recently unaffiliated with Christianity. And I wonder if there isn't a sense, like for some of them who are in that transitional process, I'm kind of stepping away from this religious tradition. I wonder if they're feeling like, hey, almost a sense of not feeling good about it. Like, maybe, this is almost like a guilt. Next year I should do better, in this area than I have.
I think, too, we don't necessarily know, when they say I want a relationship with God, what is their concept of God? I'm sure that not all the people in this group are saying, I want to go back to my non-denominational Christian church, or my whatever denomination, have your pick. They may be thinking they want a relationship with God, but maybe not necessarily the God that we're thinking of. Maybe not even a Christian God. So I think that at least it kind of shows that there is some perceived need, like, hey, I would like a relationship with God, but maybe that just indicates that there's a bunch of seekers out there. Maybe that's a potential for us as Christians to reach these people if we can communicate it in a way that they hear. But they may not all be people saying, my New Year's resolution is to go back to my local Christian church.
Yeah.
It may not be how they see pursuing a relationship with God.
Well, and we've said that. We've said that, hey, the departure of young people from the church does not mean they're departing a sense that there's a transcendent being or a transcendent God. And we see that in the surveys, which means that there's a mission field out there that would say that they are religiously unaffiliated, but are still open to the possibility that there's a God, and probably just are viewing Christianity either, like we said before, through the lens of politics or through the lens of their experience in a church. Maybe it wasn't that. Yeah. So it's really about kind of contacting, initiating that relation. And also the other thing about this poll. Okay, so what do we mean by a God? The other thing is, what do we mean by relationship? Like, what does that even mean to have? Or is it a set of increasing your spiritual disciplines? Is it more of a prayer life? Is it a sense of kind of emotional connection? I mean, what do people mean when they say they want to improve their relationship with God? It's pretty ambiguous, right? So there is some truth in that.
Yeah, this could be, potentially, depending on how we're thinking about relationship, this could all be people who go to church weekly, but just don't feel as connected, or feel like they're not holding up their end of the bargain. Maybe as you're talking about, when their prayer life and are they reading their scriptures daily, weekly, So it's a little bit hard to tell, I guess, from just looking at this survey from a bird's eye view.
Well, let me just take a quick turn on this, because I was looking then at this. This is clearly a Christian survey. Well, there's a bunch of secular surveys that came out in January also talking about secular approaches to New Year's resolutions. And here's one, for example, that was at finder.com. These are New Year's resolution statistics, top categories for New Year's resolutions in the United States. Okay, so the first one is health. And the same as the other one, same as the Christian, the first category is almost always health or fitness, something, post holiday season. And then the second one here is not a relationship with God. The second one here is self-improvement. Now, I realize that self-improvement could be a lot of things, but there's a tip-off, I think, because there's more surveys. Let me show you another secular survey. This survey is found at Country Living. Top 10 New Year's resolutions for 2022 revealed. And if you look at the list they have posted here, you'll see that the first several are health-related, right? Lose weight, eat healthier, change your diet, get fitter, get all that. Then the next two are interesting because they're kind of revealing. Spend more time with family and friends and be more aware and take care of mental health. Now, that's interesting, right? Because in the last poll where it said self-improvement, in this kind of second group, after fitness, after health, is kind of a mental health category that might be what people mean when they say, I want to improve my life in some way. And interestingly, there's another poll, which can be found here at newswise.com, that says that there's a large group, the top habits Americans resolve to practice in the new year are to spend more time with family, maintain an exercise routine, and continue stress management practices. There is a mental health component that always seems to come in the secular surveys. The Christian surveys basically, okay, health, number one. Number two, relationship with God. In the secular surveys, it's almost always health, physical health. And then stress reduction and mental health is in the second category. And sometimes that's in the form of, having less stress with your family members, less stress, just practicing stress management, or in this case, working on my mental health. So it's interesting that the relationship with God component on the Christian survey, the parallel on the non-Christian surveys are almost always some form of stress management or mental health. And so that's why I just want to ask the question of you, and then we'll take a break, is, okay, so are we just being selfish as Christians? Like Christians just see their relationship with God as the way we can manage our mental health, and so it's not like we really want God in our lives as much as we want the benefits of what a relationship with God, I'm more zen when I have a better relationship with God. Is that what it is?
Yeah, it's tough. I think that maybe some of this is just we wish that the studies had been done a different way. It wouldn't have been great for the Christian survey to include mental health or some of these other options in their survey so we could kind of see, does that change things? But I definitely could understand that there's got to be a segment of people who are coming to the Christian survey and they really are making a resolution for something related to their mental health. And they're trying to figure out which one of these options do I choose, and maybe they see some type of parallel between seeking out my self-improvement and my relationship with God as being one of the same. Or maybe even vice versa. The Christians in the secular survey are like, well, they didn't give me an opportunity to say my relationship with God, but I'll say self-improvement because that's the closest thing. Right. And I do think that there's got to be a group of people, though, that do see an overlap between my relationship with God and what I'm getting out of it. There's definitely some type of relationship there, I think.
And don't you see, even like culturally, we see that different strains or views of Christianity that are more prosperity oriented. Like, here's what God can do for you, right? This is how God can. Even you see this even in some of the churches where it's not, you're not going line by line through Scripture to see what does the scope of Scripture teach, but instead it's more topical. Here's how you can have a better marriage. Here's how you can have a better job. Here's how you can have better relation. In other words, it's like what's in the gospel is not. It's kind of like what's in the gospel that'll make my life easier, right? That's we are selfish this way, and it ends up appearing. So I'm not really surprised it might appear in a poll, but I think there is another option that might just reveal that humans actually know there is a God, and then when you deny the God's existence, there's an outcome for that. Let's take a look at that after the break. Now, I will tell you that you just mentioned something important. This idea that Jesus is borrowed from, because I was at a comedy club in Hollywood over the weekend. My son brought us out there for a Christmas gift. And so we're sitting in the comedy club, and the comedian it feels like he's probably sympathetic or raised in a Christian environment, although he doesn't call himself a Christian today. And he was talking about a conversation that was occurring between his grandmother, who's 91, and his sister. And his sister said something that he thought was so utterly hilarious, that Jesus never even lived. And he said, and there was no laughter in the audience. Like, it fell flat because he said, like, come on, like, that's not what we're even talking about here. The question isn't whether he lives, is he God? Okay, he was like trying to joke. But for a lot of people in that audience, I think they've been convinced by 15 years now of Zeitgeist, the movie, and all kinds of other people who are out there, Richard Carriers of the world, that maybe there wasn't really a Jesus. Right. So the question is, maybe they're buying into this idea, even though the Bart Ehrman, who's one of the more well-known biblical skeptics right now, he's written a book about this, making at least a defense for the existence of Jesus, right? Well, why would you need to do that? Because a lot of movement has occurred in critical thinking and skeptical thinking about whether or not Jesus is even a historical figure at all. Now, right. I can tell you so now, does Jesus resemble prior mythologies? Okay, I'm writing a new book, and I've actually gone through now I looked at every major biblical or a non-biblical deity mentioned in anything from the beginning of humans, okay, all the way through the Roman Empire. There's a ton. That took about 4 months to go through them. And I read every mythology deeply, looking for similarities. I wanted to know every single possible, and I wrote them all out. I discovered there's 15 similarities between all the mythologies and the story of Jesus. Not that everyone shares all 15. They don't. But there are 15, and all of those similarities are the things that you would expect your God to do. So if you said, hey, our God, he appeared in a miraculous way. Okay. Everyone's God appears in a miraculous way.
Right.
Is it a virgin birth? No. But it's a miraculous way. You're going to call that a similarity? Really? Like we stole that? Like I don't expect God to show up somehow that's different than just Joe next door showing up, right? Oh, am I our God so we can work miracles? Okay, so it turns out those 15 you identify are all the things that any rational person, if thinking about God, would think God can probably do this. And those show up in all of them, not all of them, but most of them. It just happens that Jesus comes and personifies everyone's expectations of God. This is what Paul's saying on Acts 17, right? I see you're a very religious people. You got lots of idols here, lots of monuments to your gods. You got a thing here to the unknown God. Well, I'm here to tell you what the real God looks like. Because you've been expecting something, and you've been right in some areas and wrong in others. I'm going to show you where you're right and where you're wrong. Well, that's, I think, what happens in history. But regardless of that, the question is the account we have on the Christian side early enough? Does it resemble some? I'll tell you, if you think, oh, he's got, just like Mithras has got all these things in common with Jesus. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. Read what's known about Mithras. There is no existing scripture from Mithras, okay, Mithraism, but you can read all that stuff. Most people exaggerate like crazy to find any similarities at all.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that. I get it.
It really is amazing, the credulity of someone who wants to find similarities between the gospel and one of these, pagan cultic religions. They'll bend everything to try to make it fit, and yet that's usually matched by an absolute incredulity and looking at the scriptures, at the perceived, inconsistencies and alleged contradictions and things. Well, that's, the slightest little, word choice difference is, well, that's an inconsistency. But then on the other side, when trying to disprove, and that really does go back to, I think, the condition of the heart. And
absolutely,
you see what you want to see.
Yes, that's where your presuppositions are overriding everything else in the game. And so that's why it's important for us to be able to talk about presuppositions. That's why it's so important for us to do both. That's why I think that's conditional before you begin this other thing. Because you can do all this other thing. If you haven't discovered what people are in their presuppositions, you're not going to get anywhere with that. Okay, so we've been talking about what it is what's the connection, right, between our religious responses in the Lifeway poll that say that the relationship with God is important, and when you take that aspect out on the secular polls, it's always about some form of stress management or mental health. So it may be that we just are selfish and we love God because it helps our mental health, and we're just seeking God because we want to have better mental health, or it might just be that people who deny God's existence are more likely to struggle with mental health and therefore report this as a goal more often in surveys like this. And I know you've been looking at an article that kind of illustrates that point.
Yeah, I think there is some evidence to suggest something like that. If we look at this article from the Pew Research Center, let's get to the bottom line. The big takeaway here for them is that highly religious Americans are happier and more involved with family life, but are no more likely to exercise, recycle, or make other socially conscious consumer choices. So let's get into the article. It says a new Pew Research Center study of the ways that religion influences the daily lives of Americans finds that people who are highly religious are more engaged with their extended families, more likely to volunteer, more involved in their communities, and generally happier with the way things are going in their lives. For example, nearly half of highly religious Americans, and the researchers, they define this as those who say they pray every day and attend religious services every week. That's how they're defining highly religious. They say that these types of people, they gather with extended family at least once or twice a month, and by comparison, about 3 in 10, so only about 30% of Americans who are less religious, gather as frequently. roughly about 2/3 of highly religious adults, that's 65%, say, this is self-reporting, but they say that they've donated money, time, or goods to help the poor in the past week, compared to only about 41%. So 65 compared to 41% of less religious people. And 40%, so almost half, of highly religious U.S. adults describe themselves as very happy, compared to 29%, so 40, compared to about 30 who are less religious. So I think it's kind of an interesting study. They're not saying when I first read this study, I was thinking, does it mean that they're happier, the highly religious people, that they're happier than the less religious people, but that this leads to, I almost expected to see some type of apathy, that because they're happier, they're actually less involved in socially conscious, positive kind of things in their communities. But it says that they're just as likely as non-religious people in some areas like recycling, and they're even more involved when it comes to things like volunteering, engagement with their families, engagement with the wider community. I think it's very interesting to see that the religious component of their life seems to drive these very positive behaviors.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is it's not like this is a kind of a Christians reporting on Christian, trying to affirm Christians. This is really, you see this all over the literature in a number of other places. So, for example, I'm looking at one here. This is an article from Gallup. Very religious Americans report less depression, worry, relationship holds when controlling for key demographics. So even in other demographics, you see this across the board. Here's another one from, this is religious affiliation and suicide attempts. This is kind of a hot button issue. This idea is, are the people who are religious less likely to be suicidal? But you see that here, for example, a Gallup survey, in more religious countries, lower suicide rates are found. So you see this over and over again, right? And we've talked about this. I think what's interesting is the notion that if I'm more likely, there is something, look, we know that when you believe that there's a God who acts consistently in your life, that you are far more likely to let go of things that you think if there's a God who's in control, then you feel less likely to want to retain control. I get it. At some point, it's a God thing. I've got to let go of this. But how do you talk yourself into letting go of stressful scenarios if there isn't someone to let go of it to? So I think the people who think there is something to let go of, a God who can carry the load, then you see this in Scripture, right? I mean, Jesus talks about this, that the burden is going to be, I'm going to carry the burden for you. Put your trust in me. My burden is light. This idea that it shouldn't surprise us, I think. And again, this is not necessarily about Christian belief in these polls. These polls are about any kind of religious belief. So I think that's interesting, that it doesn't have to be necessarily a Christian belief, but it is this idea that there's a transcendent God that could carry your burden, that actually is in control of things that you feel are spinning out of control. I think that's part of what is the mechanism here. I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily that we would argue we ought to be religious or ought to be Christian because of the things that God can do for you. But I do think there's something consistent with the idea that if there is this unchanging God, somebody who is consistent, somebody we can count on, and this is a God who promises to take care of us. I mean, one of the really almost radical things that Jesus is talking about, if you look in his teachings, is Jesus talks about not being too concerned about the future, not getting overly anxious about our plans for the future, even if we like to make plans, that ultimately, even if we gave everything up to God, that he would take care of us. Mm-hmm. If there is this kind of person that exists, this consistent God that's not going to change and promises to take care of you, that when there are those things that are out of our control, things that we're concerned about, if we just let go and kind of trust this person to take care of us, that this is somebody we truly can count on, I think that this would naturally reduce the type of anxiety that we feel. I think, I know we were just recently talking about this, that a lot of these psychological studies show that it's more the uncertainty in our lives that drives anxiety. But if there is a God that we can count on, then we do have some level of certainty that hopefully should reduce our anxiety. I think that's kind of what we're seeing here in these studies. Why would religious people feel happier, more content in their life? I think that their reliance on this type of God kind of explains why they would be like this. So it's not an argument for, hey, because we feel contentment, that's why we should believe in God. But if we believe in God, we should seek contentment. And that's what the science is showing us, that religious people do find contentment. It's consistent with our theistic belief.
Isn't it interesting that covenantal relationships do kind of provide you with this kind of sense of consistency? This is why I think, for example, you see the statistics of people who are married versus people who live together. Even if they've lived together for 30 years, both groups, that the stress levels and the success of relationships and the marital, the family, all of the certainty that comes with the covenant relationship, that kind of public statement that no, we're not just living together, that we are, the future relationships are better amongst people who marry than they are about people who cohabitate. Why? Why is that the case? Because I think there's some sense that you have more certainty or more consistent connection to one another. Now, what I think is interesting, looking backwards at the surveys that we're looking at in terms of New Year's resolutions, it does seem to me that what you're seeing is not that, well, maybe some aspect of this, that people selfishly want God to the benefits of having a God relationship. But a lot of it, I think what you're seeing is that when the God relationship is removed, and not even, you feel stress. As people become religiously unaffiliated, it might be that they hang on to the notion of a transcendent God, because without it, you have a higher stress level. So isn't it interesting that people don't abandon this one thing that they think is kind of provides order or structure? They just abandon the affiliation with groups. I can see sometimes why that might be the case. But I do think, rather than it being selfishness, it's probably more likely that people who just don't have a connection with God are feeling higher levels of anxiety, lower levels of happiness, and even if some of these reports are correct, even higher rates of suicide or suicidal thoughts. So that's, I think, of the two options. Is it selfishness, or is it just that something true about God is revealed in these surveys? The second is probably more likely.
Yeah, I don't know if we should be driven by our desire, hey, I want to be a Christian because of what I can get out of it. But I think that it's certainly true that our Christian faith does provide meaningful things in the here and now. We have this hope of a future with God in the next life. But there's a lot of hope for this life that even Christianity can give us. Even in the midst of all our struggles, there's something positive that our relationship with God can give us in the here and now, in addition to that hope for the future.
Yeah, this is a great place to end. We're out of time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on this edition of the Cold Case Christianity Broadcast. We'll see you next week.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.